Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Simone and I'm Community Manager with the Oxford Languages Marketing team, and I'll be the support behind the scenes today. I'm delighted to be here with the Oxford Languages team, and now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Casper Grathwohl, who is our host today. So Casper, over to you.
Thank you, Simone, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for a behind-the-scenes look and conversation about the Oxford Words of an Unprecedented Year in 2020. So, as you're all aware, every year we track language as the year develops, and we select a word that we feel like embodies the ethos and spirit of the 12 months that have just passed. And this year, we didn't. And it's interesting, as we tracked language and we've started to pull the insights and analysis of what was happening, we realized in the English language that a story was emerging that was too interesting not to tell in a more full way. Our lives were turned upside down this year like none other in recent memory. And the English language reflects that. It's a unique window into how the condition and the experience that we're having by how we describe it and how we talk about it. This time has truly been unprecedented, and so it felt like it would be valuable and really engaging to produce a language report that encompassed a broad sense of how the gymnastics that the English language was doing this year. And today we have 3 people joining us from the Word of the Year selection team to talk to us about the process and what took place. Fiona McPherson, the Oxford English Dictionary news editor, Kate Wild, executive editor from the Oxford English Dictionary, and Katherine Martin, the head of product for Oxford Languages. Fiona and Kate are going to walk us through some of the more interesting elements of the process we went through this year and the types of change that the English language was experiencing, and then we'll open it up to questions. So let me turn it over now to Fiona to kick us off with what makes a good word of the year. Fiona?
Thanks very much, Casper, and good afternoon, everybody. So yeah, what makes a good word of the year? Well, I think the key is impact. It's the one time of the year that editors can look at words without a view to whether they should be included in a dictionary. So you want the word to be memorable and to make an impact. Now, a good word of the year needn't be a new word. It can be one that's familiar, but for whatever reason, it's had an added oomph in a given year. But it could also be a brand new word. Anything's up for grabs, really. As long as it gets people talking and makes that all-important impact, then it's a good candidate. Here's a look at some of our previous words of the year. Now, this is a selection only, but I think it gives a good idea that there are a whole range of different types of word that we've chosen in the past. Some of these are serious, some are less so, some are political, some come from the entertainment world, some are environmental, but all of them said something about the year from which they were chosen. Some of these words, I think, have remained very much at the forefront of language and the language that we use. Some have probably faded a little bit more. But for a word of the year, that doesn't really matter. As I said, it's not chosen with a view to being added to any of our dictionaries. And in fact, it would be fine if it was already in one of them. It would also be fine if it never made its way into one of them, or if it faded into complete obscurity. So if we think about these words and the fact that we did choose one word for all of these different years, why did we choose a different approach this year? Well, Casper's already alluded to it, but this year we could have picked any one of the words that we discuss in our report, and I don't really think anybody would have argued too much. But we quickly saw there was a much bigger story to tell, and it's one that as lexicographers we can contribute to in a unique way. I don't think it's overstating it to say that language is much more than just the way we communicate, whether that's written, spoken, signed. It has the power to tell a social history as well, through the words that we use that are coined, that become important to us, and also even the ones which fade away. And the words that came to dominate our news feeds and our own conversations sort of tell the story of where we are today, just as words coined at other times, Industrial Revolution, the advent of space travel, other pandemics, they also did. And in 2020, more than any other year, certainly that I can remember, so many world events and movements affected the words that we used that it really made sense to try and tell that story in the unique way that we can. In doing so, then, we could showcase how our language monitoring capabilities let us do precisely that. It's part and parcel of a lexicographer's life, language monitoring. And certainly over the years since we've been doing Word of the Year, it's become ever more sophisticated, allowing us to delve deeper and deeper into language. So we wanted to be able to shine a light on the language monitoring that underpins all of our work and is especially relevant here. Now, I've already said that a word doesn't have to be brand new to be a Word of the Year, but this year there were a number of key new words that did emerge, mostly to do with the pandemic, either directly or indirectly, and we wanted to highlight those as well. An obvious example would be COVID-19 and resulting variants that came from it. That was brand new in February. Anthropos was another one that came along in June and while it had a more indirect connection to the pandemic, it's unlikely that it would have been coined without it. An anthropos is a chance for the natural world to take a break from us because of our restrictions, the restrictions that have been placed on us this year. And it also offered a small beacon of light in amongst a lot of darkness. But perhaps most remarkably, there was a real focus for us working in the language field on so many of the words that had the biggest impact had been around for a long, long time. And this approach allowed us to also look at those. They may not have been on our radar. Coronavirus, for example, that's been around since the 60s, but it was probably new, I think, to most of us, unless we worked in the field of epidemiology or similar. Some of the words would be much more familiar, but they still wouldn't have been part of our everyday conversations. How many of us really have used lockdown or pandemic in the sheer numbers that we have this year? How many of us thought about self-isolation? That's a term that's been around since the 1800s with the same basic meaning, but probably wasn't a word that we used an awful lot until this year. And certainly for most Brits, I think, furlough seemed like an entirely new concept. But that's been around since the mid-1800s, originally starting off in US English. So we could do all of these things, and that's really what underpins the change of approach that we had for 2020. So how did we go about to begin to tell that bigger story? Well, while as lexicographers, we pride ourselves on having our fingers on the pulse, we don't rely just on our instinct to tell us which words are making a big splash. I'm going to now hand over to my colleague Kate, who's going to introduce to you the more evidence-based methods that we used to tell the story and go into some more detail about some of the words that we identified. Kate.
Thanks very much, Fiona. So yes, I just wanted to say a little bit about the research behind the Word of the Year report, which reflects our ongoing work monitoring the English language. So one of our main resources for this work is our Monitor Corpus of English, which contains over 11 billion words of web-based news content and is continually growing. And we use this to identify new words, to identify words which have become especially frequent, because that can indicate a new sense or a new cultural relevance. And we also use it to identify changes in regional distribution, typical collocations, and that sort of thing. Corpus research is just one input, and we do lots of other analysis of a wide range of other databases and resources, but the corpus is a very useful starting point. So one way that our corpus can give a really useful snapshot of the year is through monthly keywords. So keywords are words that are significantly more frequent in one part of the corpus than in the corpus as a whole. So by doing a keyword search by month, we found which words were especially salient or significant that month compared to previous months. And this table shows the top 10 keywords in our monitor corpus from January to October this year. I've manually added some colour coding just to pick out a few themes. So there's blue for words relating to COVID, yellow for the US presidential election, red for activism and the Black Lives Matter protests, and green for environment. Of course, there's overlap between some of these themes, but this gives a broad overview of some of the patterns of the year and how different words and topics have risen in prominence. And it was really fascinating when we were thinking about the Word of the Year candidates to look back over the year in this way. So we can see that in January, there were the Australian bushfires and Trump's impeachment. And then from February and especially March, April and May, COVID completely dominated with keywords like coronavirus, COVID-19, pandemic, lockdown, PPE, self-isolate. But then there was that striking shift in June when the focus of the English-speaking world was very much on the Black Lives Matter protests with keywords like racism, brutality and defund. And then in July, a shift back to COVID concerns with lots of discussion about masks and face coverings in particular. And then we start to get the words relating to the US election again, especially mail-in with reference to postal ballots. So those are just the top 10 keywords from each month. We looked at a much longer list, but I hope that gives you a flavour of some of the data we were looking at. So we also use our corpus to help identify new words. And as Fiona said, the most significant neologism this year is, of course, COVID-19, which was coined in February 2020 and went from non-existent to one of the top 5 most frequent nouns in our corpus in April, which was just quite an astonishing acceleration. And there are plenty of other new coinages this year, things like twindemic, anthropause, which Fiona mentioned, Zoom bombing, covidiot, and others I've not listed here. There's more on these in our report. Others are new in our corpus this year, but we found other earlier evidence, so showing that they're not completely new this year, though they weren't much used before. So Blur's Day, for example, meaning a day of the week that's indistinguishable from other days, as all the days of the week sort of blur into each other. Definitely resonates with me. This became much more common during lockdown, but it dates back to the late 20th century. And even doom scrolling is at least a couple of years old, though it's become much more widely used this year. And there are many, many other words which aren't completely new this year, but which have become dramatically more frequent. And I've just put a couple of examples on this slide. One, of course, is coronavirus. So as Fiona said, this dates back to the 1960s, and before this year was a very well-established word in scientific and medical context, but it was not very common in general discourse before this year, as the graph shows. But by March, it was up at a frequency of over 1,800 instances per million tokens in our corpus. And just to put that in context, the word time in our corpus has a frequency of about 1,650 per million. So in March, coronavirus was actually more frequent than time in our corpus. Social distancing also shows a dramatic rise. Again, this is not a new term. The original sense of being remote from others dates back to the mid-20th century, and the specific sense of maintaining distance from others in order to reduce the spread of disease has been recorded since 2004. But before 2020, it was a relatively uncommon term. In March, it occurred over 250 times per million tokens in our corpus. And to put that in context, that's about the same frequency as the word food. So this just captures how these words have become just such a part of everyday language. So here are just a few other examples of words which have become more common as a result of events throughout the year. And there's more detail on some of these in our report. And there are different stories behind these graphs. So with some words, for example, the reason for the rise in frequency is a new sense. That's the case with bubble, perfectly common word in English, which this year has become even more common as a result of this new sense we're using of groups of households in close contact and support, as we talk about support bubbles and Christmas bubbles and who we're bubbling with. And if a word is becoming more frequent, that can be an indication that there's a change in typical usage, and we can use the corpus to dig into that information. So take remote, another word that's become much more frequent this year. This is, of course, a well-established word in English dating back to the 15th century. And even the sense that we've become familiar with this year of remote working goes back to 1956, as we show in our updated OED entry. But it's the rise in frequency of this sense that's really striking, and we can see that by looking at the most salient collocates of remote. That is, the words that are used near remote with a statistically significant frequency. So last year, the most salient collocates mainly related to the sense of being physically distant. So we had remote village, remote island, and remote location, as well as the fixed compound remote control. In 2020, though, that's completely changed. The top collocates relate to this sense of working and learning using the communications technology that we've all become familiar with. So remote learning, remote working, remote workforce, and remote instruction. So it was all these different types of fluctuation and change that we wanted to capture in our report. And for more of that, I will pass back to Fiona.
Thanks very much, Kate. So why didn't we choose a winner? Well, if you think about previous years that I highlighted, we've included shortlists with other words which were in contention, and perhaps most notably last year when we chose an all-environmental shortlist, but still picked a winner. So why didn't we do this? Why didn't we pick up one word to sum up this year? Well, I think, as Kate has actually really sharply demonstrated with her insight into our language monitoring, it just didn't seem like the right thing to do, and it might have undermined what we were trying to tell everybody in our report about how significant a year this had been for language. So many of these words and their themes indeed have vied for our attention and our language. I mean, you could argue that no one word will ever sum up a whole year, certainly not for everyone, but I think nonetheless it can say a lot about the year. But an eventful year like 2020 has really demonstrated that there were just too many to choose from, and we wanted to let the words speak for themselves and the patterns that we had seen emerging speak for themselves. I mean, COVID-19 and the language around it would probably be the main stories, but it didn't tell the whole story of the year, as Kate showed with her keywords slides. And I think if we had gone with one of the words, all of the time we might have thought, oh, but what about this word? That was certainly the case for me when somebody had said to me, well, which one would you choose? I came up with something, but then I immediately went on to choose another 3 afterwards. And these themes, I think, they've had almost an equal impact on all of our lives. COVID dominated, but before that, environmental words, other themes crept in. Towards the end of the year, we were getting words to do with the US election, and the ebb and flow of these words really reflect perfectly the ways in which I think language is key in describing our experiences, what's happening to us, what's important to us, changes we're making, and so on. So why not talk about them all and let them all speak? Language is a real powerful thing, and I'm going to finish with this thought. I think with a glossary to hand, a person visiting Earth for the first time with no prior knowledge of any events, I think could look simply at these words and be able to tell the story of what has happened in one of the most eventful years any of us can ever remember. And that's all because of the words that were in use.
Great. Well, look, thank you, Kate and Fiona, for walking us through some of that. We're now going to open up to a panel discussion, and I'm going to start with there have been several questions around the data that underpins the monitoring and analysis of English. How global is that data? What are the sources of that data in terms of, are they coming from online places or print or speech? And so I was wondering, maybe Kate or Fiona, either one of you, maybe Kate to start, could you tell us just a little bit about the how we build that corpus and what's included in it in a way that allows us to make these decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start. The MonitorCorp it's a web-based news material, and it's material taken from sources from all over the world. So one of the things we're really proud of about our MonitorCorp is how regionally balanced it is. So we've got data from UK, the US, Australia, Philippines, Malaysia, Africa. You know, all English-speaking countries are represented. So it's a really really rich source in that way. And I should say that the MonitorCorp is what we use for this kind of monitoring purpose, because it's updated regularly, and because it's the same sort of sources that are added each month. So it's so we can sort of track the language, because it's a very consistent resource. So that's something that's really important about that. I mean, and should add that for different purposes in Oxford Languages, we have a variety of other corpora that we use as well. And we have a reference corpus as well, and we have historical corpora and corpora of other languages and so on.
And along the lines of global, and tracking global English, I know that I was wondering if maybe Fiona, you wanted to talk a little bit about regionalisms, and how much in this extraordinary year did some language emerge that was very regional as opposed to global or international. I realized that I saw the Australian word of the year that came out from the Australian Dictionary Center, and it's ISO, which is short for isolation. So you might do ISO baking or things like that, and that was very much a term that was used in Australia. And so could you tell us a little bit about how regional variations came up, and if you've got any examples that are interesting in a way that in one place a word was described very differently than in another place, and those two different routes of entering English in a way?
Yeah, that's the very interesting thing about this. Is such a global phenomenon, obviously, and some of the words are used in common throughout the world, but we did see some regionalisms come in. And you mentioned ISO, the Australian term. That's typical of what happens with a lot of Australian English. They'll shorten something like that, and it always sounds really funny, I think. One that I think is particularly interesting was circuit breaker, and that, I believe it was Singaporean English. I think that first started to be used, and that was a good few months ago. And then in the UK, that started to emerge about a couple of months ago when we were talking about another kind of lockdown, and they called it a circuit breaker. And what's fascinating for me is that something which there's no reason why you would think that shouldn't have been used in Britain, but it hadn't been up until that point, and it had originated from a completely different part of the world. And another word that really struck me as well, and apparently this had its origins in Canada, was caremongering, which I thought was rather a nice positive word. So talking about, caring for other people, and language works like that. So yes, that's the amazing thing about our research methods. We're able to look at other parts of the world and see what regionalisms are coming in, and not just stick to the stuff, the words that we're using in Britain or the US, which sometimes that can be where the focus is.
I think that's really interesting. I was talking with someone who was telling me about how also the context that a region has around a word sometimes defines whether they use it or not, particularly for top-down words when governments are instituting initiatives and naming things officially. So for example, lockdown is a term in the US that's associated with kind of prisons, and it's punitive. The term that was used there initially for that phenomena was shelter in place, which is historically more about you shelter in place for when earthquakes or tornadoes. It's about safety, and and so that was a term that was used more in the US, and lockdown was used more in the UK. And I'm sure around the world there are great stories around what connotations different words have that are different, and so why they're being used in that way, because the polarity of those words can be really powerful.
Definitely, I think that's true. And I mentioned furlough as well when I was talking, and lots of people in the UK, they'd never heard of this word furlough, yet it was obviously, well, I'm not an American, I don't know how familiar it was, but our research certainly showed that this was a word that was in use in US English. So we've taken that for a good reason, because we needed something to describe what was happening.
Yes, no, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think there's this concept of the lexical gap that exists, which is where you suddenly have this space of a concept that you need to fill, and we can see how existing words move to fill those gaps in different ways. So I thought it was really interesting how we had a word like quarantine, which has kind of that's had an expansion of its meaning in the United States in particular. It's being applied to refer to what in the UK is more commonly called self-isolation. And so there are all of these like really specific technical meanings of these terms that are different depending on like the legal and social context. And I'm sure it changes from state to state in the United States as well.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, that's true. Another question came in, which I think is an interesting one, which and again, it goes back to that what makes up our corpus and how does that monitor, how balanced is that monitor corpus? And one of the questions is around, do you think the use of online news sources biases the results? Many Anglophone countries, such as India and Nigeria, have a vibrant book publishing in English not available online. How can these be incorporated? I think what's interesting about that question is, does the sources that they're official, that they're often news sources and the like, does that bias the corpus in a way towards certain types of language and therefore certain, it's not inclusive as it could be? And how are we aware of that, and how do we address it? Kate, do you want to take that one?
Yes, I can certainly start. I mean, it's it's absolutely the case that the data in our corpus is just one aspect of language, certainly a very rich aspect. I mean, I think you could say that news discourse kind of captures sort of quite a kind of general language in a way that's kind of covers the kind of language that we're all familiar with. But there's certainly, I mean, one kind of resource that our corpus doesn't cover is social media, which we obviously all know is going to be a really rich resource, and we're obviously very aware of that, and we search and we look up social media when we're adding words to the dictionary, for example. So that's something we're aware of, and it's I mean, I think Katherine, we were talking about this when we were talking about the kind of words that we were able to show data for, and we sort of talked about the story of, say, Karen, for example, in the report, but gave a more sort of qualitative discussion of that rather than quantitative, because we're aware that our corpus is not going to give the best picture of that compared to, say, a social media corpus, which would. Katherine, I'm sure you've got more to say about that as well.
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to note that we make dictionaries and other kinds of lexical resources, and as our lexicographers, when they're doing their work, they're looking at corpora all the time in this data that we're showing here, but that's not the only thing that they're looking at. It's one tool among many, and so we spend a lot of time looking at social media. We have reading programs where we have actual humans reading books from all around the world, and we really try to focus on those less easy to find online sections of population, so particular social groups and areas of language that we think aren't going to be well covered in some of those news sources. And as a lexicographer, you're bringing together all of these different strands to understand how words are used and to decide what words go into the dictionary and things like that. And so when we're making decisions about the word of the year, we have those qualitative and small data sources, and then we have this big data source. But for the purpose of making graphs, then we rely on the corpus data, which has many advantages, and including the fact that it's balanced over time, which is quite difficult to do with non-periodical sources, because we're trying to capture a similar amount of content every month across these different genres. So you can see if you were including novels, how would you fit them into those? So it's one tool. We love the power of what it shows, but it's one tool among many, and we totally agree it's not giving us the full picture. And so part of what we're doing in Oxford Languages is always trying to expand and find new ways to give as rich a picture as possible of all of the different ways that English is expressed in the world.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. We've had a few questions about our competitors and their Word of the Year program. So, I think this year, both Dictionary.com and Cambridge, I think, selected quarantine as the Word of the Year. I know Collins was lockdown. And a lot of the questions are really about how competitive is it? How aware are we of other Word of the Year programs, and do we compete with them? Do we communicate with them? Is there a strategy there that we use? Maybe Katherine, do you, as head of product, want to just give your view on how do we approach the word of the year in thinking about competitors, if at all?
Well, that's actually something, when dictionary people get together, we often talk about the word of the year. How was yours this year? Well, I really love the one that you took. That was great. Wish we'd thought of that one. So we kind of have a very friendly interactions about that. But I would say it's if you know that each group that has a word of the year is trying to accomplish something different with it, and so I think we're all focusing on different things that are specific to our particular company's interest and expertise. And so with our background in the OED and historical lexicography, I feel like the Oxford Languages Word of the Year is always about change. We just love to draw attention to the fact that language is changing all the time. And so that tends to be the thing that comes through in ours. But we're always interested to see what other people who watch language observe from their particular perspective, which will be based in what their unique expertise.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Here's a question that came in around remote learning. It said, I find it interesting how the term remote learning has come into more common usage, despite the existence of distance learning as a label for the same kind of educational practice. Why do you think this is the case? Is it to do with being a new enforced temporary practice that we've been using remote learning rather than the traditional distance learning? Or perhaps just that it's ridden into the English language on a wave of the term remoteness and joined all of the other remote plus and collocations. Fiona, do you have any kind of thought on that, the term remote, and particularly with remote learning, but also remote in general, and why remote over distance or the like?
That's really interesting. I mean, English is a very rich language, so we often have, synonyms for things that at the basic level mean the same thing, but perhaps there are slightly different contexts where you would pick one over the other. And I think both of the suggestions made by the person who's asked the question could go some way to explaining why. We have had a real cluster of words around remote, so it was another obvious choice. And distance learning, yeah, that already existed, but I think that perhaps was seen. If you're distance learning, you've chosen to do that. It's more of a choice rather than having something which I think plenty of us hope is a temporary situation. With remote, we've been sort of remote from our work, remote from our friends. And so I think it's probably, there's a slight nuance there, which distance learning just wouldn't quite cover. Because we wouldn't have, remote working, for example, distance working. Well, I'm sure I'll probably, if I go and check, I'll find some examples of that. But it doesn't seem to have, it doesn't have the same resonance anyway. So I think it's a great example of English always innovating, coming up with something new or alternative, which just puts a slight different spin on the situation, maybe.
Yeah. It's a lot of language that we captured this year, and as much as I think there may be, I don't know, 30 or 40 kind of core words and maybe 60 or 70 words in that language report where we tell a bit of their story of how they changed this year. There's so many more words, obviously, that you can point to as having a particularly rich existence this year, in some way. But I think some of the questions that are coming in are around how ephemeral this language really is. And so, I would ask the question around, with all this new, particularly the new vocabulary right now, how much do you think that's going to stick? How lasting do you think a lot of this vocabulary is, and will we be living with it for a long time? Or are we really seeing sort of a flash in the pan around a lot of words that we really don't expect to be seeing a lot of once we move through, well, at least the kind of formal pandemic period and the like? I don't know. Katherine, do you have any view initially on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, if there's one thing that I've learned in my time working with dictionaries, it's that you should never try to predict the future about words, because you will be wrong. But if we look back at, and obviously we hope that one reason that some of these words would go away would be a great reason, because hopefully we have no reason to use these words anymore. And then they will cease to be common and cease to be commonly understood, because the concepts they refer to will no longer be relevant. But if we look back at some major events and traumatic years of the past that have brought language to us, these things do tend to persist if for example, on the metaphorical level of English, lockdown is probably going to be, it's already coming up in different contexts, it's being used figuratively. So I think I can see that continuing to be a word that we use a lot. And 5 or 10 years from now, we might not remember why anymore. That's what I see happen over time. When you look at events of the past, you have words that came in because of a particular topical event or a particular context, like military words that have come into English. But as they become naturalized, the ones that stick around, they eventually become divorced from that original context. And so that's why we have resources like dictionaries. That's why you look at the etymology and you're surprised to see that original connection, that original origin is where the word comes from.
Yeah. There's also been a few questions around other languages, both word of the year programs in other languages, but also how the development of other languages influences English. And so maybe Fiona or Kate, do you want to kick us off and just talking a little bit about how does other languages that are rapidly evolving as well, how are they influencing English? And how are we incorporating in as English speakers some of that vocabulary? And does that get considered as potential words of the year, or these, sometimes it's called loan words or things like that? Can you tell us a little bit about how other languages are at play in this kind of global language ecosystem?
I'm happy to start off, Kate, and you can jump in at any point if you like. English is a truly global language. So part of, not just with Word of the Year, but part of what we do in Oxford Languages with the OED is, we'll include words which aren't necessarily from British English. So we do look at world Englishes, as we call it. And in terms of Word of the Year, any word from any part of the world would have been up for grabs. We were interested in not only, we're interested in looking at which words are being used more often, but also just which words are being used as alternatives for things. I mean, and I think I mentioned earlier about circuit breaker. That's a really good example of a word which came initially from a different variety of English, from a different part of the English-speaking world. And we've now, in Britain, certainly, I'm not sure about the US, perhaps one of you two will have an idea on that, but that's now used and seems completely natural. So English has always been open to other influences from other languages and other parts of the world. And this is just really a continuation of that, I would say. And we'll see some of that in our corpora as well, I'd imagine.
Yeah, no, that's true. And Katherine, I mean, can you talk to us just a little bit about the work that we do across languages and the ways in which we're trying to align some of our work across languages to enhance and optimize interlingual research and communication?
Sure. Well, the word of the year that we're talking about now is the English word of the year, but Oxford Languages has content, I think, in 35 to 50 languages. We cover a lot, although people do tend to associate us with English above all. And we're engaging with local speakers of those languages, and we do bilingual dictionaries, but also increasingly are working to help make connections with monolingual dictionaries in other countries as well. We did a project earlier this year where we actually looked at the language associated with COVID-19, and we created some glossaries compare, like taking the key concepts that were coming up in the context of COVID across a very large number of languages. And I can't remember off the top of my head how many, maybe one of my colleagues here will, but we were looking at Tagalog, Russian, we're covering all over the globe. And that was an example of how we see not only words travel from language to language, but when you have a new concept that emerges, it's something like this. It's hitting the whole world at the same time, and so the same lexical gaps are emerging at the same time in different languages and being filled. And so that's something with our monitoring. We're not just looking at English. We're looking at that whole multilingual context. And of course, many speakers, especially outside places like the United States and Britain, are in multilingual contexts all the time, and that's how they're expressing themselves. You know, they live in rich multilingual societies where they might use the English term or a term.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, one question has come up in various ways around the timing of this year, and the fact that it's called unprecedented, and we keep saying we haven't seen anything like this in recent history. Are there times, one of the things that Oxford Languages has with the OED, which is a historical dictionary, is a really rich history of tracking how English has been changing and the evolution of the language over centuries. And there's a question specifically around, are there other points in history, particularly modern history, where there have been such major events or changes that we've seen the same kind of linguistic evolution rapidly, like this? So that is this year, are there any other times in history that we see parallels to this year, and what are they, and what kind of characteristics do they share? Do any of you have any thoughts around other time periods where there's been a lot of rich linguistic evolution?
I think any time where it's a real period of change is inevitable that we're going to have to get linguistic change as well. So society changes, and then language will change to reflect those changes. So whether or not that's to talk about a brand new concept, whether that's a different word to talk about the way we have to interact with each other, whatever it is. This year, I mean, probably because we're living through it, seems like we've never seen anything like this before. And maybe if we spoke to somebody, if we had a time machine, spoke to someone from the turn of the 20th century, maybe they'd say, wow, I've never seen anything like this. Certainly previous pandemics, thinking of things like Spanish flu towards the end of the 19th, early 20th century. Go back further to the Black Death times, but then there's also more positive things as well. A lot of the time we get asked, with social media, are there more new words than ever? And my answer is always, well, it's not so much that there are new words necessarily, so many more, we're just much more aware of them. But social media would also be an example of a time where we've had an influx of vocabulary, some of it already existing. I'm thinking things like tweet, that was already a word, obviously. Sure. Now it's got a different meaning now, or an extension in its meaning. Lots of words around social media have come into the language to talk about the sites, to talk about the way we interact, all of that kind of thing. So yeah, I think any period of change will bring linguistic change, whether or not on the same scale, it's hard to tell because we're not looking at it in the same way, but definitely it would have happened.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, what's so interesting about this year is that the major event, the pandemic, that kind of has driven so much. We've seen linguistically the fact that there's so much gravity of change around the pandemic that it has cascaded into almost every other facet of life and language. So whether it's political language or slang or medical or financial, the pandemic has so much weight that it has created a significant ripples of linguistic change through so many facets of our life. And when you think about that, like, it's easy to think about something like, World War II, for example. I've seen dictionaries of World War II or the language, because again, there are events like that that are so all-encompassing that there's no aspect of life that isn't affected by that, and therefore language is changing there to reflect that condition. So I'm sure that those moments of major global change will always accompany linguistic energy. It's just interesting, as you say, for people who've lived through some of those periods to think back through that perspective, and through the perspective of language change, identifying where those rapid periods have really occurred.
I think one really interesting parallel to a war situation is that people are communicating with different people globally in that's something that we saw in World War I and World War II. So you had groups of English speakers who wouldn't or speakers of English and speakers of other languages who, because of the mass movements of people at that time, were talking and interacting in different ways, speaking new words, and those were spreading really rapidly in a way that was unusual. And I think that you can see that happening this year because of the fact that we are all talking to each other through our computer screens in a way that we didn't before. And I think that's disruptive in the sense that we are exchanging more words each day with people who are not physically proximate to us. And so I would hypothesize that that is having an impact on the ways that words are spreading geographically and kind of disrupting what we usually think of as the taking the element of space out of some of the ways that words are traveling. We're being exposed to words that are coming from farther away.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. As I'm scanning through the questions, I can see there's several of them where people are taking the opportunity just to note how interesting it is to talk about word change and lexical evolution. And a couple of the questions have come around what do you need to do to be able to be a lexicographer and work at a place like Oxford? And I thought, oh, that's a kind of interesting question. Kate, do you have any thing to share around, like, what are the criteria around becoming an editor on something like the OED?
That's a really good question. I mean, one thing I would say is that I don't think there's definitely not just one path. I mean, the editors on the OED and around Oxford Languages have a really wide range of backgrounds. So there's editors who have a background in history or linguistics or classics, and then there's editors in the science team who have a background in science. So there's certainly not a particular sort of academic path. I think there's a core set of skills you need to be a lexicographer. Analytical skills, probably a very wide-ranging set of interests. That's very useful. So yeah, I think I just a sort of deep interest in language. I think if it's something that the questioners are interested in, I would encourage it. It's a great job. So I don't know if Fiona and Katherine have other views on that as well.
I think what you said is right. I mean, in a way, I don't know that any of us thought we would be doing this job. I certainly didn't. I remember doing a module, I think it was university, where they were talking about dictionary editors, and I was thinking, wow, you never really think about there is somebody who puts these words into the dictionary. And of course there are people who do that, but it's not something that you necessarily think about. And I think a real enthusiasm for language definitely helps. As Kate said, there are so many people who we work with who have such diverse and different backgrounds, and that's part and parcel of what it's like. Certainly with historical lexicography on the OED, you need a lot of curiosity and tenacity as well. But what I think one of the biggest compliments I was ever paid was somebody had asked me, I think at a social occasion, what I did for a living, and I told them I put new words into the dictionary. And I kept talking, and they said, wow, that's a really cool job, and you can tell you love it just from the way that you're speaking about it. And that was a great compliment to me, because when your alarm goes off on a Monday morning and you have to go to work, you don't necessarily think about how much enthusiasm and how much you actually love what you do. And I think I certainly feel very privileged to do this job. But as Kate said, anyone, honestly, anything goes in that sense. So if you've the more diverse background you've got, the better. And it's a job that for anybody who's interested in this kind of thing is a possibility.
No, it's definitely. I mean, I'm not a lexicographer myself. That's not my training. I work with a lot of people like Katherine and Kate and Fiona, and it's worth noting. You know, there are the characteristics of a lot of the lexicographers in our program, as Kate said, really analytical and just sharp, but wickedly smart when it comes to the kind of precision with which they approach things. I'm always impressed by that, and I think also just a general intellectual curiosity that I see that in every single person who's within that program, is that they're constantly sponges for absorbing all kinds of new information that you know contributes to their understanding of the language. And you know, I have to say, not as a lexicographer, I still feel so privileged to work with most of the folks at OUP in this program. So yeah, it's that's just a plug for the next generation of lexicographers. So well, that's a good one. Let's move on to a little bit around what comes next. There have been quite a few questions about just the fact that if this is something we've never done before, we've always picked a word of the year, at least for the last 2 decades or so. And, you know, we didn't this year, came out with this language report. What happens next year? Are we expecting to go back to, you know, what seems now maybe like a humdrum way of picking one word, or maybe the task seems harder? Or, you know, do any of you have any thoughts around what this means for word of the year 2021, and whether not picking one this year will have an effect on how we handle next? Maybe Katherine?
I was thinking about this earlier. Oh, sorry.
No,
Just
no.
jumping in there.
Yeah. What do you think?
I was just going to say, it was something I was thinking about earlier, and I thought, what are we going to do next year? Will we just pick one word, or but really, Katherine mentioned this earlier, you cannot second guess the language. If you try, you will be wrong. So it really depends. So I get that's not an answer. It's just more sharing my my questioning of it. A lot will depend. We can't imagine a year quite like this, and certainly in terms of language, but who knows? But maybe this time next year we'll all be talking about whatever it is we've chosen in a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Katherine, I jumped in.
You know, did we did we like jump the shark and somehow, like, you know, how do we go back?
No.
But it's really interesting. I mean, it makes me think of the year when we actually, we didn't pick a word, we picked the tears of joy emoji, when emojis were just starting to explode, and how, I mean, first of all, that created so much, a surprising amount of debate, kind of ferociously strong on both sides, of people who thought, you know, it was the end of the English language, and other people who were celebrating the fact of, you know, kind of our evolving ways of communicating. And we kind of thought, okay, how do we go after that? And I think then the next year we picked a word. And so, you know, we kind of we reset, but I don't know how that will happen this year. And some of it is really that there's just so much unknown around how the next year plays out. But I know we will be tracking and monitoring, analyzing linguistic change over the year as part of the core activity and of the program, you know, this coming year. And we always have an eye towards looking for words of the year as we're doing that. Maybe a pattern or something will emerge that will inform how we should approach it next year, even if it's going back to a single word that we feel like really captures that experience. We'll have to see. We only have a little bit more time. 2 people have asked a question that I thought was really fun, which was, what was your favorite word from this year? Could each of you go? Kate, do you want to start? And then maybe Katherine, and then Fiona. What do you have a favorite word this year?
I did have a think about that, because I predicted that there might be a question. So yeah, it's a difficult year to pick up a favorite word. I mean, it's you know, it's not been the most positive set of words, but I think so. I mean, I'm always interested in words which have a longer history, but which have taken on a sort of new sense or usage. But I do particularly like bubble, which I mentioned in my slides. I mean, I think bubble is just a great word anyway. It's got a lovely sound, and the thing it denotes is very fun. And then it's had, you know, it has all these different figurative uses anyway, especially to do with being protected. And I think it was really interesting that it was that was the word that was chosen, at least in the UK and in some other countries, to refer to groups of people who can be close to each other and to support each other during the pandemic. And it's so, yeah, just quite a sort of cheering word in this otherwise quite difficult year.
Yeah, no, that's great. Katherine, did you have a favorite word this year, or something that kind of resonated with you most or tickled you?
Yeah, well, I'd have to say mine is anthropause, because that's a great example of the classical new lexical gap emerges, and we have a word that fits into it. So that's where there's a decline in human activity, and it causes a noticeable decline in carbon emissions. But what I think is also interesting about that is that we're seeing that anthro prefix be used in a number of different contexts right now to indicate the human impact on the environment. So Anthropocene is a word that's become much more common in the past decade or so to refer to this era as a kind of a geological era that's defined above all by the impact of humans on the world. So that anthro is being used in a new way, and this is a new coinage that's showing that new.
Yeah. And Fiona, what about you?
I'm going to be thinking on my feet here because anthropause is actually also my favorite one, but I can pick something else. No, that's fine. That shows that we did not get together and discuss this first, right? I think I'll, not wishing to be flippant, because obviously it's been a difficult year, but if we're looking purely at language, one that tickled me, and it may just be a more ephemeral one, was coronial, which was, I believe, coined on the sort of analogy of millennial to talk about the potential or the result of the expected baby boom from people being in lockdown. And I like the idea that we can still have something that makes us at least smile or raise an eyebrow in language, even when we're, you know, we've got so much darkness and so many difficult words or difficult concepts to talk about. So I will say coronial is my second choice then.
Oh, that's a fun one. I do like that, and just the sort of idea that, you know, we start to go into lockdown and then there's a bunch of children that are born 9 months later is kind of a fun thing. But also, look, this is a defining moment in history where it might be that there is a generation that comes that this is very formative for, and it'll be really interesting. Coronial might be a term that sticks. For me personally, I you know, as you say, sort of I have a couple more fun words, you know, in a year that has been a really challenging one. But one word, just unmute, was one that, you know, I spend most of my days on video calls, you know, and the number of times someone says, "You're on mute," or "Sorry, I was on mute. You have to unmute." You know, that it's just, that is a constant refrain. And you know, it's words that I use so rarely prior to, you know, March of this year. So unmute was a good one for me. All right, well, look, we've come to the end of our hour, and we had a lot of questions that have come through, and really appreciate everyone's contribution. And I just wanted to thank Kate and Katherine and Fiona for participating in the panel, and for everyone who's been listening. I hope that you found this engaging or interesting, and look forward to what we end up doing next year. It'll be an interesting 2021. I assume that our language will be reflecting that, and we'll do what we can to capture that in our Word of the Year campaign 12 months from now. So thanks again, and let's all put this year to rest and start to think about a really positive 2021. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and bye everyone.